Everybody here made their living somehow off the water.
Very busy place, yeah.
Take it on up.
All these fellows with hand trucks moving barrels and bags.
This was an incredibly happening place. People with power, people with wealth.
The whole oystering industry was just absolutely, huge.
It was the driving force of the economy.
By far, this has been the oyster capital of the world.
Prior to 1926 or 25, almost all the oysters were shipped out as shell stock oysters. That was based on floating of oysters, where they took oysters in from the bay, from the grounds, put them in floats out in the river, and let them blow themselves clean and reseal. That was the secret of floating. It also, since the salinities were lower, puffed up the oyster, the meats, and they looked nice when you open it.
Makes it more saleable, but it also cleaned out any sand they would have in them and things like that. They'd float out there a month maybe or some time, and it's all according to how bad somebody needed the oysters, I would imagine. You had to fork them off because you can't get a shovel in amongst the oysters. You have to use a fork to get in there, but the fork was the same size as an oyster shovel, except it was a fork.
And then the oysters are moved from the floats into scows, and they're basically like floating boxes, these square boats that move the oysters from the floats over here to the wharves. And the scow gang were the fellas that helped move the oysters.
A crew of men would go in there, and then they would bag up the oysters, a couple of bushels to a bag.
And picked up the oysters in bushel baskets. They busheled them up onto the dock as they go.
And then the guys would put them on a hand cart and hand truck, they called it, and wheel it out to the train.
It must have been quite an intense operation when that train came for everybody to have everything set up to go ahead.
On a typical day, 80 boxcars filled with oysters.
Take it on up.
And that's not like some peak. There's actually a fella, I'm told, who counted when he was a kid here, counted 127 boxcars filled with oysters.
I saw numbers that were mind-boggling, as far as how many oysters were shipped out, and they went all over.
St. Louis was a big market. San Francisco, Denver.
As far away as Canada and across to the west.
Schooner John Reed, 25,800 calls, $193.50.
They had record books, and we sat down and looked through the pages of plantings and harvestings from their leases. And we figured out that just one company had about 1 million bushels of oysters on their grounds.
No mechanization like we have today with no electronics. I mean, this was all done by hand. You had 16 guys on the boat, on the bigger schooners, and they got on their hands and knees and they dumped the dredges by hand and they called them out by hand and they shoveled them back and they shoveled them overboard if they were planting.
The work on the boat was out in the bay was sundown, and I'm sure that matched the men here. It was probably that's what my dad called from ken to can't, from when you can see to when you can't see. Ken being Elizabethan English.
It's amazing how many people from all over the place will say that they remember driving down here on a Sunday afternoon to watch the schooners leaving.
Of course, back then they didn't have any power, and they used to have to leave here and on Sunday to go up the bay to go to work on Monday morning.
It was a ritual, and there must have been as many people on the shore watching as there were people, participating.
And I can remember here at the end of these wharves and everything where the boats probably, most of them would be stacked 5 and 6 deep.
People would talk about how it looked like you could walk from, deck to deck up and down the river. And, the sails were just, the river was just white with sails. and you know they're all so beautiful and graceful. But imagine how there must have been loud, though. Just imagining all those boats moving up and down the river at the same time it must have been spectacular. Bivalve in the 20s and 30s was a hugely relevant place. There were senators, there were governors. It was known. This was a place that people went on excursions just to see what was happening. They went here to pick things up that they needed from the chandleries or the markets.
Oh, there were lots of businesses here. Oh, all along the dock there were businesses.
There was a post office, there were hotels.
There definitely was a restaurant and the ticket office and waiting room for the ferry boat.
2 sailmakers in the area needed them. We had 2 blacksmith shops, and they built the dredges from scratch. You don't go to a store and buy a dredge.
I hope that a visitor to Bivalve and the shipping sheds will be able to kind of close their eyes and imagine the activity, the vibrancy that was here. But at the same time, it's not all about the history. I hope that they can, stay here long enough to soak in the activity today and recognize that it may have a different flavor to it, but that Bivalve is still relevant. And the activities along the bay shore and in the bay are still very meaningful. There are still people making a living here. There are still incredible natural resources, and they're there and available for people to connect with. They're just amazing opportunities for having your eyes open to a whole nother side of the world, and it's a beautiful one.